This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, good evening, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and I'm so glad you're joining us this evening, or maybe you're listening to us a little bit later on the recorded podcast, because the nice thing about the live programs is that you can listen to them later. I do listen to quite a few of the live programs, but I can almost never catch them while they're live. But I do listen to Father Tom Soroka and Father Evan and the Lowe's and others, and they're really wonderful. So you can listen to this live, and if you wish to call in with questions, you can. If you're calling about, if you have any questions, by the way, regarding the Passion of Christ, anything specific, you can send me an email and at Search the Scriptures at ancientfaith.com. Search the Scriptures, all one word, at ancientfaith.com, and I'll be sure to talk about it. Try not to think too far ahead. Don't ask me anything about Caiaphas or Pilate or the trial or anything, because we're going to get to that, but we must take it one step at a time. So we are discussing my upcoming book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, the Sublime Mystery, Amazing History and Sublime Mystery of the Passion. Well, I have to be sure I get the whole title in. But you can just remember The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. That's going to come out in mid-March, God willing. And I gave you a little bit of background last time, trying to explain to you why I think a study like this is important and useful, and what I'm hoping to accomplish by it. And we are going to journey to Jerusalem. We're going to be present when all of these amazing things happen. So we're on our way to Jerusalem. And today our focus will be on the temple at Jerusalem. This is a very important subject, and it doesn't seem like it would be very important. We all have heard about the temple, blah, 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 and Jesus was teaching in the temple. We really don't know anything about it, though. And you know, it turns out that the temple is extremely important for what happened to Christ. It's very important for its relationship to Christ, the Jewish leadership. It comes up at the trial. He's, we know, of course, that he's often present in teaching in the temple. So certain events happen there. Then after, the resurrection and ascension and Pentecost, the apostles are also going to the temple, and later Paul goes to the temple in the book of Acts. So the temple looms kind of large, but we really don't know very much about it. But it is quite amazing. So I want to describe it to you as best we can. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. This is basic stuff that you should really know. Very, very basic. And you might not know it. That's okay. It's okay if you don't know it. Nobody's born knowing. We're not born knowing these things. We just learn them. But one of the reasons why I do think it's important to have kind of basic Bible literacy, to understand basic concepts, events, people, places, because if we don't understand these basic things, how are we going to really follow what's going on in the Gospels? How are we going to understand the Gospels? So this is why there are so many of you who are very, very curious about the Theotokos, the life of the Theotokos. And so many people are intrigued and they read these apocryphal works because they want to know more about her. And of course, much of the content of the apocryphal works is false. It's not true. And people write to me and say, well, but how can we find out more about her? How can we know what's true in these books and what's not true in the books? And I'm asking you, why are you bothering to try to learn about these things? There's a reason why we're not supposed to know more about her. We're supposed to know more about Christ. Okay, so it's not that there's something wrong with wanting to know more about the Theotokos, but the church has already told us everything we need to know from the feasts of the church. All right. So this is not we're not supposed to try to feed our curiosity. We're not supposed to meddle into her private life. We're supposed to focus on Christ. He is the means of our salvation. Not that the Theotokos isn't worth studying, but do you realize that in Orthodoxy, we do not have a category of theology for the Virgin Mary? Did you know that? Because there are Catholic theologians, and they will say, my field of specialty is Mariology. We don't have that in Orthodoxy. We never talk about Mariology. Her importance is because of Jesus Christ. Now, that's not to say that she doesn't have spiritual importance and she's an exemplar in all of this. I'm not trying to minimize that. I just want you to know more about Jesus and the Bible so that you can understand the Gospels and the stories. That's much more fruitful, much more beneficial to you spiritually than trying to figure out what stories in the Apocrypha are true about Mary and what's not. And we're never going to know those things. So why are you wasting your time on that when there are basic things about the New Testament that you don't know? Can you name the books of the New Testament in order? All of you former Protestants or current Protestants, you can all do that. I'm not worried about you. It's all those cradle Orthodox that probably can't. Okay? So there's a lot to know about the Bible itself, and this is what God has given us. This is the inspired Word of God. So I just think people should know more about the New Testament, about the temple, and basic facts about the life and the time of Christ, so that when you read the Gospels or hear them read in church, these things make more sense to you, they're more meaningful to you, etc. Okay? So today our focus is on the temple at Jerusalem. There were only 2 temples in all of Jewish history. Just 2. Solomon's temple, which is called Solomon's Temple because it was built by Solomon. Now, the site of Jerusalem itself was a Canaanite city. Jerusalem is a mesa. It's a plateau. It is surrounded on 3 sides by deep gorges. It's very easy to defend for that reason. That it was a very strategic place. That's why they built a city there. So it was a plateau. It was very difficult to conquer the city. And when the Israelites left Egypt, when Moses led them out of their slavery in Egypt, and then they eventually crossed the Jordan River and entered the promised land of Canaan, led by Joshua. I hope you know all of this because Moses died on the top of the mountain and Moses was buried. He never entered the promised land. You probably know that. So when Joshua and the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, they never conquered Jerusalem. They did not complete the conquest of Canaan. And because of this, they had a lot of problems. So all of this is discussed in the original Search the Scriptures podcast, the one that's pre-recorded. You can find it here on Ancient Faith Radio, or you can find it at orthodoxbiblestudy.info. There we talk about the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the things that happen. Now, eventually, a couple hundred years after that, along comes David. And David wanted to build a temple for the Lord because ever since the time that they left Egypt, they were worshiping in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent. And David wanted to build a temple to the Lord. Now, the other thing that David did, which is very important, David is the model king in the Bible because of his devotion to the Lord. But the other thing that he did was that he completed the conquest of Canaan. So when the Hebrews entered the land, the Lord told them to get rid of all the Canaanites because the Lord knew that they were going to start imitating the Canaanites and worshiping idols. And of course, that's exactly what they did. But the Hebrews did not finish the conquest of Canaan. There were some cities that were never conquered, and other things happened I won't get into. One of the cities that wasn't conquered when they migrated out of Egypt and finally entered the land, one of those cities was Jerusalem. So it was a Canaanite city. It was David who conquered Jerusalem, entered it, and made it his capital. And ever since then, so David lived around the year 1000 BC. So that was about 3,000 years now. So for about 3,000 years, Jerusalem has been considered the kind of capital of the Jewish nation, of the people of Israel, because David conquered it, and that has been sort of the seat of Judaism for all of this time. That's a very long time. And it is sometimes called the city of David because he conquered it and made it the capital. Bethlehem is also called the city of David because that's his place of birth. Now, when he conquered the city and made it his capital, he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And ever since then, the worship of the Lord was centered at Jerusalem. Ever since the time of David. That's a pretty long time. Even at the time of Jesus, it had already been 1,000 years that this was the place where you came to worship the Lord. That doesn't mean you couldn't pray to the Lord elsewhere, but that's really the heart of Jewish worship at Jerusalem. So David brought the Ark of the Covenant. He set up the tabernacle, and the worship of the Lord began there. And after that, by the way, this is also where the sacrifices of animals were all supposed to happen, right there in Jerusalem on this particular mountain. Now, why there? Well, there was a mountain. The highest point in the city of Jerusalem is Mount Moriah. And according to Jewish tradition, this is the mountain where Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac. So this has a lot of importance to Jews. This was like an extremely important moment in Jewish history. We're going to talk more about that later because it is related to the sacrifice of Christ. So it was very important for Jews. So this is Mount Moriah. Now, today, there is a mosque on that site. If you look at a picture of Jerusalem today, you'll see a structure with a huge gold dome. That's a mosque. And the site, it's on the place where the temple once stood. And that site is sacred to Muslims also. And Muslims, also the Arabs at least, trace their lineage back to Abraham also. So do the Jews. So the Arabs are descended from Abraham through Ishmael, and the Jews are descended from Abraham through Isaac. So according to the Quran, Abraham was tested by God and told to sacrifice Ishmael. Okay, so the Quran changed some things, all right? So Ishmael becomes the hero of the story, not Isaac. And Isaac is nothing, Ishmael is everything. So that is a very important site for Muslims too. So that's why there's no temple today, because the site is occupied by a mosque, and it's a holy site for Muslims as well. Now, so the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by it's already on a plateau, on a mesa, and it had tall, thick walls all the way around it, especially, of course, the place that wasn't. It was on three sides. It had sheer cliffs and deep gorges. But on the one side, of course, where it didn't have that, they had to have a very, very thick and tall wall to protect it. All cities had walls. Without a wall, your city had no protection. So in antiquity, all cities were walled cities. They all had walls. And Jerusalem was just like that. So within the city, There were also areas where there was, so within the city you had Mount Moriah, but there was also another elevated place, another mountain. Now, when I say mountain, I'm not talking about huge mountains. For us, would probably be more like a hill, but it's called Mount. Okay. There was also Mount Zion, also called the upper city later. So sometimes all of Jerusalem is called Mount Zion, and sometimes these terms aren't used very accurately, let's say. So you might hear Mount Zion and you think it's referring to all of Jerusalem. Well, it kind of was for some people. So that other mountain, Mount Zion, was opposite on the west side of Mount Moriah, where the temple once stood. And in between there was a valley called the Tyropian Valley. So Tyro, Tyro, Tyropian. Okay. If you're Greek or you've ever been to, something about Greek cuisine, one of the favorite dishes is a little puffed pastry with cheese inside called tyropites. So that's a Greek word, obviously. Tyropian Valley was the valley of the cheesemakers. All of this is within the city of Jerusalem. So what I'm trying to get across to you is that there were different elevations in the city itself. It wasn't all flat. Okay, because this figures into the way we're going to approach the city and how we're going to get up to the top of the Temple Mount. Before we go any further, let's talking about the temple. What makes it different from a synagogue? Because you may have, or in your city, you probably do have synagogue that's called Temple Beth Israel or Temple Beth Torah or Temple something or other. That is not a temple. That is a synagogue. If it has the name temple, then you know that site, that place of worship is Reform Judaism. Only Reformed Jews, those are the most liberal Jews, maybe not the absolute most liberal Jews, but they're more liberal on the scale. Only they call their synagogue a temple. So if you have a friend who says, well, I have to go to temple on Saturday, well, they're a Reformed Jew, because the other Jews, the more conservative Jews, the Orthodox Jews, do not call their synagogue a temple out of respect for that temple that was destroyed long ago. So we'll get more into the difference between a synagogue and a temple in a moment. So there were only 2 temples in all of Jewish history. The first one was built by Solomon. David wanted to build the temple, but the Lord wouldn't let him because David had killed a lot of people. And it wasn't appropriate for a person who had blood on his hands to then go about building a place of worship. So he raised the funds and he had the plans drawn up, and he knew that it was going to be left to Solomon to build the temple, and he did. And Solomon's temple was very, very grand, opulent, glittering, dazzling, full of, beautiful, precious stones and gold and all kinds of things. It was really remarkable. Well, after 400 or 500 years, that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians when they conquered the city and took all the Jews away to Babylon as slaves. That's called the Babylonian exile. Well, they didn't stay in exile very long, because the Babylonians were themselves shortly thereafter conquered by the Persians, and the Persian king allowed all the Jews and other slaves, that it's not just that the Jews who were being conquered, everybody was being conquered. Okay, there was a lot of war, and different nations were conquered. So the Babylonians didn't just target the Jews. You have to be very careful when you're reading history or you're reading the Bible or thinking about the history of these times, not to filter it through the presumptions of our own times. So the Jews weren't targeted by the Babylonians because they were Jewish, all right? Nobody cared who you worshiped or how you worshiped, really. Nobody really cared about that. What the Babylonians wanted, what the Assyrians wanted, what all these different empires wanted was territory. So you just happen to be in the way. They want your land, so they're going to conquer you. And when you lost a war, you became the slave of the enemy. So when the Jews lost the war against the Babylonians, they were taken off as slaves to Babylon. That's always what happened when somebody lost the war. They always became the slave of the enemy. That's where slaves came from back in those days. It was not an ethnic thing, was not a racial thing or anything like that. They were conquered peoples. So they went off to slavery in Babylon, and then the Babylonians themselves got conquered by the Persians, and the Persian king Cyrus the Great, in a very smart move, liberated all of the slaves that were being held by the Babylonians. And that was a lot of people, lots of different tribes and nations around the kingdom. So all of a sudden, Cyrus is very popular. The Persians are very popular, and people are given their freedom and they're allowed to go back to their native land. So some of the Jews returned to their homeland. They were still under Persian rule. They didn't come back and start they weren't liberated and they're given their land back. They were just liberated from their slavery. So they returned. And of course, one of the main reasons why some of the Jews wanted to return was to rebuild the temple, because without the temple, they could not perform the sacrifices which were required by the law of Moses. So the Torah stipulates certain sacrifices, animal sacrifices, that had to take place for certain festivals like Passover or Yom Kippur, or certain types of offerings for sin. You could not sacrifice an animal any other place except on that site. So that's why it's so important. That's why there is no Jewish temple today. It must be on the site where there is currently a mosque. And it's a very sensitive political issue, of course. So they couldn't just sacrifice anywhere. It had to be there. So they came back and they built the temple. Now, not all the Jews came back. A very large population stayed in Babylon, and others began to settle in different places. This is how we ended up with the Jewish diaspora. Jews began to live in many different parts of the Persian Empire, and eventually the Roman Empire, and under the Greeks. So now some of them, however, were very devoted, wanted to come back, and they rebuilt the temple. And this temple, which was rebuilt around the year maybe 510 or 520 BC. This is BC because the previous one was destroyed by the Babylonians around 586 BC. So within, about 70 years, they had a new temple. This second temple is called exactly that, the Second Temple. It's just called the Second Temple. Now, when they returned from slavery and they rebuilt the temple, it was kind of small and not very impressive. It was nothing like Solomon's opulent temple with all its glitter and its gold and its precious stones and things like that. It was nothing like that. But at least they had a temple, and they were able to resume animal sacrifices as required by the law of Moses. Now, this temple would eventually be expanded and embellished by Herod the Great, but it was always just called the Second Temple. If you ever hear somebody call it Herod's Temple, that's a big mistake. It was never Herod's Temple. It was never called by the Jews Herod's Temple, even though Herod began a program of beautification. But there were just two temples in all of the history of Judaism. And it was extremely important, as I said, for religious reasons. Now, what this also means is that the Jewish temple was unique in the ancient world because it was the only temple to the God that was worshipped by the Jews. Now, there are many, many temples that were dedicated to Zeus or Jupiter when the Romans came along, to Aphrodite or to Artemis or Diana, many, many temples all around the Roman world and under the Greeks too. Many, many, multiple temples. But you don't have that with the Jews. For the Jews, there was only one place in the world where you could go to offer animal sacrifice to the Lord as required by the law of Moses. At a synagogue, you never offered animal sacrifices, and there were multiple synagogues. There were thousands of synagogues. Practically every city and town had a Jewish synagogue. But this was a place where you had prayers and you heard scripture readings, and people taught the law. There was a sermon, that kind of a thing. That's where the Jews gathered to worship on the Sabbath if they lived outside of their native land. And most Jews by the first century did not live in Palestine. That's very hard for us to remember. They did not live in Palestine. The vast majority of Jews lived all over the Roman Empire, and their language was Greek. They did not know Hebrew. And they met on the Sabbath, and they sang the Psalms from the Septuagint, and they read the scriptures from the Septuagint, and they didn't think there was anything wrong with that people didn't know Hebrew. That's like us. We hear the Bible in English, so nobody thinks there's something wrong with that. So this is how life was for the Jews. They had one temple. Now imagine if there was only one place in the whole world where Orthodox Christians could receive Holy Communion. How important would that place be? Very important, right? Very, very important. So this is sort of what the temple meant to the Jews. It was not only the only place where you could offer animal sacrifice, it was also for them the place where God dwelt, where God lived in a very real sense, not in a silly sense. They didn't think that God was somehow confined to a box in the temple, but there was a very strong belief that God was present with his people because this temple was standing there. And as long as the temple stood there, God would protect them and they were safe. So this idea of the worship of the Lord being confined to Jerusalem is something that, is something difficult for us to imagine. Again, they worshiped the Lord in synagogues all around the Roman Empire, but sacrificial worship to the Lord was only taking place in the temple. So Herod the Great became king of the Jews in the year 37 BC. Now, he was not really Jewish. He was actually an Idumean. And Idumea was a nation just south of Judea. It was a different tribe. Okay, it was a kingdom and it was a tribe, the tribe of the Idumeans. They had been conquered by the Jews and they had been forced to become Jewish. They were forcibly converted. Well, this was like 100 or more years before Herod the Great's birth, but that worked out very well for him because he got to be proclaimed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. And there was some politicking going on there between Herod the Great's father and Julius Caesar and the Roman Senate. Now, it wasn't handed to him on a silver platter. Herod had to fight for it, and he was brutal and he was ruthless. But he was able to establish himself as king of the Jews. He had that whole region, which is today modern-day Israel, and also parts on the other side of the river, Jordan. And it wasn't exactly aligned with the boundaries of modern-day state of Israel, but pretty close to it, okay? So Herod the Great becomes king of Judea, and the temple is nothing to write home about. And he set about enlarging and beautifying this temple. Now, why would Herod, because he's not a very religious guy, I think we can bank on that. Why would Herod want to beautify the temple? Because he wanted it to be a showpiece. He wanted it to make a statement. Just like today, when the government builds a building, it doesn't want to build something that's kind of small or a little bit ugly. They want to build something impressive. Monuments, public buildings and monuments are designed to be beautiful and impressive. And this was the only Jewish temple in the whole world, and he was the king of the Jews. And by golly, he wanted it to be impressive. So he began this beautification project. So this period of Jewish history, by the way, you should know this, is called Second Temple Judaism. When the Jews returned from exile in Babylon and begin to build the temple, Judaism has a different character than it did during the earlier eras of the Old Testament, earlier parts of Jewish history. This is called Second Temple Judaism, and it is a period of time during which the Second Temple stood. So from about 510 or 515 BC until the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So Herod wants to go about beautifying and enlarging the temple. So the temple is sitting on Mount Moriah, which is a hill inside the city of Jerusalem. Now, when you think about a hill or a mountain, because I'm going to call it now the Temple Mount, that's what it came to be called, the Temple Mount, don't imagine something pointy or round on top. Herod took whatever was not flat and flattened it. So he flattened the Temple Mount. That's the first thing he did. And he made a big square surface. He made a much larger surface area for the Temple Mount. So he flattened it out like a builder might lop off the top of a mountain or a hill to put a house there. So it's not pointy. It's a big flattened area. And Herod built massive retaining walls all around the Temple Mount to hold up the mountain. And so on the top of the mountain now, it's a big flat area. And this was the beginning of what Herod the Great contributed toward the temple. He began his beautification project. We're not exactly sure when he started this. His enlargement and beautification around the year maybe 20 BC. The historical sources aren't in agreement. And it took 80 years until it was completed. 80 years. And then the Romans destroyed it about less than 10 years after that, in the year 70. So it was finished around the early 60s, and by the year 70, it was completely destroyed because the Jews rebelled against the Romans. It's not, again, don't imagine that the Romans said, oh, we hate those Jews, we're going to go get them. It's not like that. They don't have an animus against the Jews. The Jews rebelled against the Roman Empire, and so the Romans had to make sure that they sent a message. They had to put down the revolt, because if the Romans allowed the Jews to revolt and get away with it, they would have revolts all over the Roman Empire, because the Romans conquered a lot of different nations, a lot of different kingdoms. So it's a great irony of history. But the destruction of the Second Temple marked the end of biblical Judaism, and Judaism changed dramatically after that. But we haven't even set foot on the Temple Mount yet. So we're going to take a little break. And when we return, we're going to start ascending up to the temple. Join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF Radio.
Hi, my name is Tom, and I am from Lafayette, Indiana. And I actually grew up in the Assemblies of God denomination, and now I attend an Episcopal church here in Lafayette. But I just wanted to say that I discovered Ancient Faith Radio maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's just amazing how much talent, production-wise, but all the on-air talent. It's really top-notch, and I enjoy the music and the podcast and the talk call-in shows. Dr. Constantinou is the top 1% academically, how she handles everything on air. Really, I could be probably Orthodox. A lot of the beliefs line up to my personal theology. So I just wanted to say it's been just such a blessing. And I just loved being able to have the opportunity to give this week to provide and help the ministry that's going on up there in northern Indiana. And y'all are just outstanding. I want you to know that I'm praying for you all. And thank you very much for all that you do.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
That was a very nice little promo there. I hadn't heard that before. That was very nice. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. In Lafayette, that was very, very nice. Okay, so coming back to the temple. Now, when we think of the temple, when we hear the temple mentioned in the Gospels, we probably imagine something like a very big church. But the temple was not a single building, but a huge complex, because this was a massive institution that was foundational, very, very important in Jewish life. There were archives there. There was a treasury. There were meeting rooms, colonnades, porticos, storage rooms, rooms for the priests to live in, all kinds of things there. So this is a huge, huge complex. And the temple, excuse me, completely dominated the city of Jerusalem. It occupied about 1/4 of the land area of the city. Now imagine the city where you live and having one complex, one institution that takes 25% of the land. How important would that be? That's kind of a signal of the importance of the temple. Now, also, when we think of the temple, we might think of a kind of a quiet place of prayer, but it was not like that at all because our churches tend to be quiet most of the time. But the temple was not a quiet place. It was a place of a lot of activity. And there were animals that were being brought in, and there were trumpets were being blown some of the times, and sometimes Levite choirs were singing, and people were talking, and they liked to pray out loud, by the way. So they were praying out loud, and there were animals that were making sounds, and you could hear the animals making noise as they were being sacrificed, and the wood burning, crackling on the altar, all kinds of noise. It was a very busy place. But as I said, it was the house of the Lord, the house of God. It was a place where God really dwelt. And in that way, and because there was only one temple to God for all the Jews throughout the world, it was very, very important. For them, it was like the center of the earth. And it had a place, it was a unifying factor also among the Jews. All Jewish men were supposed to give half a shekel a year as a sort of dues payment to support the temple, because it costs a lot of money to maintain this huge institution. And there's a story in the Gospel of Matthew about somebody comes up to Peter and says, "Does your master pay the temple tax?" And Peter says, "Yes." So he goes back home, he finds Jesus, and he says, "Do we pay the tax?" And then actually they hadn't paid it, okay? By the way, they used to keep records. We say we don't think that these things actually happened, but they kept records. They kept records of the taxes, well, who paid and who hadn't paid. And those records were kept in the temple. And there was something else that was kept in the temple. Genealogical records were kept at the temple. And when Herod the Great became king, I think I already told you this, he burnt the genealogical records because it was obvious that he had no claim to kingship. But other people had their own copies. They had their own family records that they kept. So we're pretty confident about the genealogies. But they used to keep track of who paid the temple tax and who didn't. So in this story, which is only in the Gospel of Matthew, the Lord tells Peter to go to the lake and cast a line for a fish. And when he pulls it out, inside the fish's mouth is a shekel. And so they each owed half a shekel. So the shekel covered both of them. So Jesus actually said, we don't really have to pay the tax. That's not exactly how he said it. He says, "Peter, from whom do the kings of the earth take tribute? From their sons or from others?" In other words, does a king tax his own family, or does a king tax the people, all the other people? And Peter says the others. And Jesus says, then the sons are free. In other words, we don't owe anything because Jesus was the king. So he says, we don't really owe the tax. But so as not to give offense, go cast this line in the sea, and the first fish you catch, you're going to find a shekel in its mouth, and go pay the temple tax for you and for me. So he did it, even though, isn't that interesting? There's a lot we could say about that little story. The Lord didn't stand on principle and say, I'm not paying the temple tax. I don't care what anybody says. No, he says, so as to not give offense, let's pay the temple tax. So the temple was the domain of the priests. The rabbis were in charge of the synagogue, because the synagogue was a place where they taught the people about the law of Moses, where they read the scriptures, where you heard a sermon, you prayed the prayers, you sang the psalms. That's the synagogue. The temple was nothing like that. The temple was a place for animal sacrifice. And this was something that priests did, not rabbis. Rabbis had nothing to do with animal sacrifice. Now, not only did the temple unify everybody because it was the place where God dwelt, there was only one temple for all the Jews worldwide, but also because it was a place of national pride. The temple at Jerusalem was the largest temple complex in the world. In the world. And we're talking about a place, Roman Empire, that had a lot of temples. This one was the largest and very possibly the most opulent, unrivaled by any pagan temple. The wealth of the temple is beyond imagination. It had a lot of gold decorative embellishment, which I'm going to describe to you, but also a lot of coins. A lot of coins because of the temple taxes and the contributions people made from the Jews came from all over the Roman world. We don't think about people traveling because it's hard. We feel like it's a great inconvenience for us to get in the car and drive an hour to church. Imagine if you lived outside of Palestine, you had to walk and you had to take a ship and you had to really make a big effort to get to the temple. But people did it. We know this. So they would come and they would bring their offerings, and the temple was a place where there was a tremendous amount of money. And of course, this is part of the reason why Jesus was a threat to the temple, because the people who benefited from the economic engine that the temple represented didn't like they considered Jesus a threat to the temple establishment. So let's talk about this. The city of Jerusalem itself had about 50,000 people at that time living in the city of Jerusalem. 3 times a year, every male, every full-grown adult Jewish male was supposed to come to Jerusalem for these 3 feasts: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, Shavuot, okay? Or Sukkot. Shavuot was the Pentecost. So Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those were called the pilgrim festivals. And if you were a full-grown Jewish man, you were supposed to come to Jerusalem for those festivals. So the city would swell. Not everybody could come. I mean, if you're in Rome or Greece, it might be too difficult to come. But if you were in Egypt, you could get there. There was a huge Jewish population in Alexandria, Egypt. It might take you a week to walk there, but you could get there. So people used to travel to Jerusalem, and this population of Jerusalem swelled from 50,000 to 200,000 or 250,000 people when people would come for these pilgrim festivals. Now, women did not have to attend, but they often did. Other people were exempt if somebody was extremely old or the very young, people who were blind, who were unable to, were not very mobile, they were exempt because, as you're going to find out, you had to climb a lot of steps to get up to the Temple Mount. But most men would try to attend. Now, think about a city. You might live in a city where there's some really, let's say, tourist attraction, like New York City. There's a lot of industry, there's a lot of publishing, there's a lot of, finance in New York, but it's also a tourist place. Or San Diego, where I live. This is a place that depends a lot on tourism. Well, so is Jerusalem, because there were constant streams of visitors coming to Jerusalem. They might come for one of the pilgrim festivals, but they might come just to offer sacrifice for some other reason. So there were constant visitors coming to Jerusalem, and all around the Temple Mount, there were all kinds of shops and stores that sold all kinds of things. They provided all kinds of different services, barbers and dentists and physicians and people who sold perfume and sandals and all kinds of souvenirs. They even had souvenirs back then. The temple, as I told you, Herod was working on the temple. He started the work to enlarge and beautify the temple. And that took 80 years. It employed 18,000 workers at a time. 18,000 people were employed on this construction project. I just want you to get a sense of the scale that we're talking about here, because it was a massive scale of construction. Also massive were the gigantic stones that were put into place in order to support the temple. And these stones are, it's unbelievable. They're mentioned in the New Testament, that the disciples are looking at the Temple Mount from the other side, from the east side where the Mount of Olives is. And they say, look at the Lord, look how large the stones are. Okay, but we'll get to that momentarily. So there were lots and lots of different kinds of laborers, stonemason and different kinds of craftsmen and people who worked in precious metals. All kinds of people were needed to build and improve the temple. And all of this was ongoing. In the time of Christ, the temple wasn't finished. So there was constant activity to try to improve and embellish and enlarge the temple. But it had begun by Herod the Great. So there was all kinds of, one of the things that you probably aren't aware of is that people were expected to come to Jerusalem and spend money. And that's actually in the Torah. It was called the second tithe. You were supposed to spend a certain amount of money when you came to Jerusalem, and you could buy anything. And this is the time when people would indulge things. They would buy wine and oil and grain and lovely, delicious sweets and fruits and maybe sandals or perfume. This was the time when people would spend money if they had it, and most people would save at least something so they could enjoy the feast. It was considered part of the celebration of a feast to have a lot of food, and especially food that you didn't eat very often, things that were considered luxury items like meat and a delicious wine, more expensive wine, and jewelry, buying jewelry. This was all part of the experience of coming to the temple for a feast like Passover. Now, the temple, as I mentioned, stood on the highest point of the city, which was Mount Moriah. And Herod had lopped off the top of the Temple Mountain to enlarge the surface area. He put large walls, retaining walls, and filled in the space to make a much bigger plaza. And this huge plaza, which now made it the largest temple complex in the world, this huge plaza was called the Court of the Gentiles. The Court of the Gentiles. Now, to give you an idea of the size of the, I'm looking through my notes to give you an idea of the exact size of the stones that were used to support the foundation of the temple. Yes, here I found it. Some of the foundation stones, by the way, so I said the work on the temple never stopped. That's why it's not called Herod's temple. That's why it's still the second temple, because all of the sacrifices continued constantly. Sacrifices were offered to the Lord twice daily, in the morning and in the afternoon. That never stopped, not for a single day. All of the work, all of the stones that were used to build and beautify the temple, all that work had to be done off-site, and because you couldn't have dust and workers working there on the site, and then they were brought to the site. Now I want to give you an idea of how large some of the large foundation stones are, because they're still there. Some of the foundation stones measure over 40 feet long, and they're 7 feet wide. Okay, if you're in Australia, that's 12 meters long and 2 meters wide. That's the size of a bus. Now imagine they had to carry that somehow. They had to bring that from another site where it was quarried and put it in place. Just imagine the effort that was involved in that, and imagine the skill of these people, these ancient people 2,000 years ago, before you had dynamite, before you had cranes to do all of this manual labor. They were shaping these huge stones and putting them in place, and those stones are still visible, okay, especially to archaeologists who go inside the Temple Mountain. But this was what made it so impressive, and that's why Herod wanted massive stones. It's much easier to find a stone that 2 or 3 people could pick up and move it, but something of that size, that's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So let's talk about how we are going to ascend up the Temple Mount, because right now we're in the valley below. You have Mount Moriah on the right. Let's pretend we're inside the city of Jerusalem. Mount Moriah, let's say Mount Moriah is in front of us. The temple is on the top of that mountain. And to the left is Mount Zion. There, and in between, there's a valley. Now, today, you don't really see those elevations because people have been living in Jerusalem for 2,000 years since the time of Christ, and the land has been built up. So you don't see the low points or the high points, as it's not as obvious if you go to Jerusalem today. But now we're standing down there below in the valley below, and down there in the Cheesemakers Valley, you have all kinds of shops, and many of them are right up against the Temple Mountain, and they're nestled in these massive archways that frame this huge staircase that is one of the ways that we get up to the Temple Mount. The only way you could get up to the Temple Mount, the top of the mountain, that didn't involve stairs was a long bridge that spanned the valley between Mount Moriah and Mount Zion. So the bridge went across to Mount Zion, which was also called later the Upper City, and that's where all the rich people lived. That's where Caiaphas lived. That was where all the rich folks lived. All the ordinary folks lived in the valley below and the other parts of the old city. But that's the Upper City. So they could just take a bridge and cross over the valley. But most people had to climb the steps to get up to the top of the Temple Mount. Now, for you to be able to visualize this, I'm going to ask you to imagine a square, because we're going to talk about the north side of the Temple Mount, the south side, the west, and the east. Okay, so the best way for you is to sort of visualize a square, and I'll try to describe it as best I can. Jews never entered the temple from the north. There was no entrance to the Temple Mount from the north. Actually, on the northwest corner was the Antonia Fortress. That was the Roman garrison where the Roman soldiers would spend their time, and this was actually a fortress that was higher than the court of the Gentiles, above the Temple Mount, at a key position where the Romans could look down and observe everything that was going on the Temple Mount. The Antonia Fortress was built by Herod the Great, and he named it for Mark Antony. And he did this because he was trying to, when Antony and Cleopatra were fighting Octavian for control of the Roman Empire, Herod was sort of standing by, trying to figure out who was going to win this war, because he wanted to be sure he aligned himself with the right side, the correct, the winning side. And he figured that nobody could beat Mark Antony and Cleopatra, because she was queen of Egypt, of course, and he was a very powerful Roman. But of course they lost. But in order to curry favor with Mark Antony, he built this Roman garrison that's called the Antonia Fortress. That's where the Praetorium is. That's where Jesus is going to appear before Pilate later in our story. So on the north side, we're not going to enter from the north side. On the west side, so it's on the left of your square, this is where the bridge spans the valley. But in the valley below, there are a couple of ways to get up to the top of the Temple Mount. There was a large exterior staircase. I kind of mentioned there were huge arches that supported this massive exterior staircase that you could walk up to get up to the Temple Mount. And underneath the arches, you had all these little shops where people sold all these different things that people wanted to buy. But in addition to that, there were also 2 openings in the mountain, and people could enter into these openings. There were corridors that allowed you to enter from inside the mountain. There were 3 gates that punctuated. This is the western wall. So nothing remains of the temple itself, not even one stone. What remains is this wall, the Western Wall. Some people call it the Wailing Wall, but this is the holiest site for Jews today. It's the Western Wall. Now, what you look at today, if you were to go to Jerusalem, is just a fraction of what it used to look like. The Western Wall, this is the retaining wall that's supporting the mountain. Above it is that flat surface that we want to get up to. The western wall was 1,590 feet long. That's a third of a mile. Just imagine the scale, about half a kilometer. And there were 3 gates that allowed you to enter from the western side. As I mentioned, there was a huge exterior staircase, but there were also interior corridors. There were openings at the base of the wall, and you could come in through one of these staircases inside the mountain itself that had these vaulted corridors. And it's not like going through a tunnel like it's really ugly. They were beautiful. They were supported by these columns, and within them there were domes. It was a series of domes supporting columns, 4 columns with a dome, and you went through up, you ascended up within the mountain itself, and then you got out on the top of the surface of the Temple Mount. Now, if you wanted to come from the east, and on the east side, this is the right side of your square, you could enter through a large staircase that was on the east side, and the gate through which you entered was called the Golden Gate. And there was another massive retaining wall that supported the Temple Mount on the south side. And this was also very, very long, 912 feet long, or 278 meters. Now, this massive wall, let's pretend we're on the south side. We're looking at this massive wall and the Temple Mount above, and we can see the temple above. From the south side, it is not at street level. The base of the wall is not at the base of the valley. In order to go up into the temple from the south, they had a huge staircase that ran the entire length of that wall, 900 feet, and it was called the Monumental Stairway. And you had to walk up that staircase just to get to the base of the wall. And then from the base of the wall, you could go in through one of 2 openings. One was called the double gate, and the other was called the triple gate. We're not going to go into the triple gate. The triple gate had 3 openings. That's why it was called the triple gate. But it was more of a utilitarian entrance. This is where they had a lot of storehouses and other kinds of places, storerooms and other kinds of places where they kept tools and all kinds of things like that. So visitors didn't go through the triple gate, but many, many people preferred to go in through the double gate because it was considered spectacularly beautiful. This again led to an interior passageway 240 feet long, or 73 meters. It consisted of these beautiful domed chambers that were supported by these immense marble columns, and they were decorated with rosettes and grapes and vines and flowers. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And then you would slowly ascend. This is from inside the mountain now. You would go up through this interior, beautifully decorated passageway, and then you would find yourself, you see the sunlight ahead of you, and you'd find yourself on the top of the Temple Mount. And you were near a place called the Royal Stoa. Now, let's start by talking about the top of the Temple Mount. As I mentioned, it's flat, and most of the area does not consist of buildings. Most of it is a flat, open area called the Court of the Gentiles, because anyone could be up there, even if they were a Gentile. So this is a big flat area, the Court of the Gentiles. And it was, of course, decorated beautifully with stones of different colors. And all around it was a colonnade. Have you ever gone to some place in Spain, or we have some places like that here, even at our University of San Diego, there are covered colonnades. In other words, there are rows of columns that are covered, they're sheltered. Well, there was already a row of columns called Solomon's Portico on the east side. And then on the south side, there were 4 rows of columns called the Royal Stoa, and those columns were covered by a tall roof. And those 4 rows of columns created 3 long corridors, And that's where the merchants sold the sacrificial animals and the money changers changed money, that sort of thing. So that was like the marketplace on the Temple Mount. Now, on the other three sides of our square, on the left side, the west, and on the north, and also part of the east, you had a massive double colonnade. Now, these columns were huge. When I say double colonnade, there were two columns. There was two rows of double columns that ran along the entire expanse at the top of those retaining walls. The columns were 40 feet high, about 12 meters high, and they were made of marble, the finest white marble. And between the two rows of double columns, there were about 50 feet or 15 meters, and above it was a roof that was lined in cedar panels that were carved. So this is where Jesus was teaching. So when it said that Jesus was in the temple teaching, he wasn't in the temple courtyards because that was a very busy, noisy place. He was up there in one of those covered colonnades. And as I said, they are 50 feet wide. Just think about how wide that is. And underneath you're underneath a roof that is lined with cedar, beautifully decorated, beautifully carved in this colonnade. And this is where people would go to meet and listen to a sermon or some teaching by Jesus. Now, we're going to go into the temple courts themselves. But first, we need to take a break. So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so we are on the top of the Temple Mount in the court of the Gentiles, and the whole area, the whole courtyard, all the way around the whole Temple Mount is rimmed by colonnades. On a couple of sides by double colonnades. Excuse me one second. Yes, Dad? What is it, Dad?
Just wanted to say hello.
Okay, hello. Go back and sit in your chair. Go that way. They'll go that way. I couldn't. He was just staring at me, so I couldn't concentrate with that going on. Okay. So it's the whole Temple Mount is surrounded by these colonnades. At the south, it's the Royal Stoa, which is basically, it forms a marketplace. On the east side, on your right, you have, if you're facing north, you have Solomon's portico. But the other side, on the west side and the north side, you have this double colonnade that was created by Herod the Great. Now, we want to go into the temple itself. Now, the temple is a series of sacred spaces that get progressively more restrictive and also progressively higher in elevation. Now, to get into the temple courts themselves, we had to pass through an opening. There is a low wall all the way around the temple structures themselves, not the court of the Gentiles, but the structures. So the court of the Gentiles takes up, I would say, it's like, I don't know, 75% of the space of the Temple Mount. Most of it is in the court of the Gentiles. So the actual sacred space is much smaller. And the whole sacred area is surrounded by a low wall. It's called the wall of separation. And so when St. Paul talks about the wall of separation, this is what he means. Gentiles could not go beyond that wall. It had openings in the wall every so many feet. And if you were Jewish and you were ritually pure, you could pass through the opening and then enter the areas that were sacred, that were more sacred, that were exclusively for Jews. In other words, only for those who are ritually clean. Now, if you were not Jewish or ritually clean and you entered there, they could put you to death immediately on the spot. That was the only exception the Romans allowed for the death penalty. And there were signs that warned people in Greek and Latin that if they progressed beyond that point and they were not Jewish, they would be killed immediately. And archaeologists have discovered 2 of those placards, okay? They found both of them are in Greek. They haven't found any in Latin yet. But that's called the low wall or the soreg. And it kept unclean people away from anything that they might defile by touching it, including exterior walls of the temple. They didn't want anybody touching even the exterior walls of the courts. Okay, so that's why they have another wall separating you. So you would pass through this opening and went all the way around the temple courts. Now let's go into the temple from the main entrance. There was a huge gold door that led to the first space. And this was the court of the women. And anybody could be there. Any Jewish person could be there, women and men. Now, women couldn't progress farther than the court of the women. But this is a place where a lot of important rituals took place. Now, the court of the women was a large square courtyard, very large square courtyard. And it too was lined with columns. And the columns supported a balcony above. So you could be if you needed shelter, you could be underneath those columns and be sheltered. You could be in the open courtyard. You could be up above in the balcony looking down on all the festivities happening below. Everything was made of white marble. And throughout the temple, if it wasn't decorated in gold, it was often decorated with alabaster and stibium, which is a silvery, shiny stone. Everything was decorated beautifully. And within next to the court of the women was also the treasury. So sometimes that's called the treasury. Jesus sat in the treasury. It's not really the treasury. He's in the court of the women, but next to it is the treasury. And because the treasury was right nearby, this is where people brought their offerings and the temple taxes were held and this sort of thing. There were 17 boxes in the court of the women. They were very tall and thin. So a long thing you would drop your coin in at the top and it would drop down to the bottom. 17 boxes where people could drop coins. Sometimes it was for a special kind of offering, a thanks offering. It might be for the wood. It might be for the gold of the temple. This is where Jesus saw the widow put in her 2 pennies, okay, in this part of the temple. Now, the court of the women, as I said, is the site of a lot of the festivities and a lot of celebrations. And it was dominated by 4 huge lampstands, gigantic structures. And on top of each of those structures were 4 massive bowls. And those bowls were lit for nighttime festivities, especially for the Feast of Tabernacles. And they were so large that the light could be seen throughout the city, and it was said to illuminate the entire city of Jerusalem. And it was there at the Feast of Tabernacles, in the light of these giant lamps, that the Lord Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," you see. So now we're in the courtyard of the women, this big square space surrounded by these colonnades. Now in front of us, are 17 steps, semicircle steps that lead up to the next space, the next restricted space. The steps are in the shape of a half circle, semicircle. On those steps, on important occasions, the Levite choir would sing. Now, at the top of those steps is a massive set of doors, 2 doors called the Nicanor Gate. It's shiny brass, very, very shiny. And it was so huge, and the brass was of such quality that it was said that those doors were more valuable than all of the other doors in the temple. There were lots of other doors because there were spaces, doors that led to spaces for different kinds of, activities and storage houses, and all of them were covered in gold or silver. But it was said that the Nicanor Gate, this massive, massive gate that was about 60 feet high, 18 meters high, these massive gleaming bronze doors led to the next area. Now, as a woman, you couldn't go into that next area. But on either side of the Nicanor Gate, the double doors that were made of brass, you had 2 smaller doors. And if you were a woman and you wanted to see what was happening and you couldn't see looking through the Nicanor Gate, you could stand at one of those smaller doorways, and this is where women would watch the sacrifice being offered for their child if they came for purification after childbirth. So Mary would have stood to the left of the Nicanor Gate and watched the sacrifice being offered for Jesus after the birth of Jesus. But now, let's pass through the Nicanor Gate. Let's climb up the 17 steps. And by the way, there are 17 psalms called Psalms of Ascent because people would recite the psalms as they would go up each one of those particular psalms as they would go up each one of those steps. Those are called the Psalms of Ascent. So now we're going to go up those semicircular steps through the brass gates of the Nicanor Gate. And we're going to find ourselves in the next space, and this is the temple court. Now, I'm calling the whole area the temple court. It's a massive area, but this is where the most sacred events happen, and this is where the sanctuary itself is located, the most sacred space. But just imagine, again, a very large area, and it is rimmed. Now, I'm calling these, by the way, courtyards because they're open to the sky above. They're open to the sky above because animals were sacrificed, and like those giant bulls that I talked to you about, there was fire there. So these are courtyards because they're open to the sky. They're not closed. It's not an enclosed space. So in the temple courtyard, we just walked through the Nicanor Gate, and in front of us is the temple courtyard. Lining it all the way around are various rooms. And by the way, there's a second story with more rooms. Now, these rooms had different functions. Some of them were for holding the salt. There were storehouses for salt, for wood. There were places where purification rituals might take place. One of those rooms was the chamber of hewn stone where the Sanhedrin met. So these rooms had a lot of functions because there was a lot of work that went on at the temple. Lots of different deeds and activities took place. So we just passed through the Nicanor Gate, and now we are standing in what is called the Court of Israel. If you are a Jewish man and you are offering a sacrifice, this is where you came. You didn't come just to look. You could only be there if you were offering a sacrifice and you were a ritually pure Jewish man. So you came through that massive set of bronze doors, and you're now in the Court of Israel. It is part of the larger temple court. You're in one big space, but you cannot progress very far because you're not a priest. The Court of Israel extends the entire width of the temple court, of this particular courtyard. So imagine 2 courtyards. One is the court of the women, and another one, we're in a separate courtyard, which is the temple court. It's very, very wide. The Court of Israel is very, very wide, but only 18 feet deep because there's another low wall And that's the area that is restricted for priests alone. So you as a Jewish man come in this area and you bring your animal, you give it over to the priest, and you watch the animal being sacrificed. No one could enter the area which is restricted to the priests, and that area was called the court of the priests. It's all part of this big temple court, the second courtyard that we entered beyond the Nicanor gate. Only priests could enter there. Even Levites could not enter into that sacred area. And because only priests could go there, priests had to be trained to do absolutely every job that would be necessary, any kind of repair work, any kind of stone masonry or goldsmithing or silversmithing, anything that was necessary had to be done. Priests had to know how to do that because only they could enter the sacred spaces. So now we've handed our animal over to the priest, and we're standing behind the low wall, and we're going to watch the priest sacrifice our animal. All right. And I'm going to describe for you what you're going to see. Now, farther back in the temple court is the sanctuary. That is a closed building. That's God's house. But before we get to that, let's talk about what we see in terms of the sacrifice itself. We've handed our animal over to the priest. On the far right is the area called the place of slaughtering. And this is where there were stone pillars with rings, metal rings, and they would put the animal's head into the ring and they would sacrifice the animal. There were also hooks, iron hooks that were hanging down because they needed to hang the animal so that they could remove the skin. Now, this didn't happen all the time, but some of the time they would remove the skin of the animal. It depended on the type of sacrifice. There were also big marble tables where they would cut up the animal because some parts were intended to be burnt and other parts were not. So this is where we could say bloody work was taking place. And it was very, very bloody, okay? Because then they would collect the blood and they would put it on the base of the altar, etc. So on the far right was the place of slaughtering. On the far left was the altar itself. Now the altar was massive, and you ascended up the altar up a ramp. And of course, the priests walked up a very large ramp up to the top of the altar. They would stand on the altar. They would stand on the rim of the altar because the altar was 25 feet up from the ground, 8 meters high. Okay, that's pretty high. And the altar itself was 50 feet wide, or about 15 meters. It was square in shape. So it was about 50 feet. That's huge. That's the size of the altar. And the priests would tend to the sacrifices by walking barefoot along the rim of the altar. And there were different sacrifices that were burning there on the altar. Now, beyond the altar that was burning all these various sacrifices was the laver. And that was a large brass container that contained fresh water. So you can imagine what kind of engineering was required and what kind of supplies were needed to keep this kind of thing going. So we're standing in the temple, in this court of Israel, and we're looking beyond now. We've seen the altar of sacrifice. It's this huge square platform upon which these different sacrifices are being offered, and the priests are walking around the perimeter and they're taking care of the different sacrifices. Beyond this area is what looks like a square box, but it is huge and it's covered in gold. And that is the sanctuary. That is the holy place. That is the holiest of all of these holy places. Now, as we look at it, the front of the sanctuary is square. But again, think of the scale. This is huge. It is 172 feet wide and 172 feet high. That's about 52 meters. By the way, these measurements are given to us in cubits. All right. So I tried to translate it into something that you could understand. Okay. So 172 feet, that's the size of a 17-story building. It's equally as wide as it is tall. Okay, that is the sanctuary. Now, in order to ascend up, again, I told you, each of these areas becomes progressively more restrictive and higher in elevation. To get up to the entrance of the sanctuary, there are 12 steps. So there are 12 large steps that take you up. If you were a priest like Zechariah, to whom it was the lot had fallen to burn incense before the Lord, he would ascend 12 steps to get to the entrance of the sanctuary, of the holy place. Now, this is again a massive square. It looks like it's actually rectangular, but as you face it, it looks square because it's equally wide as it is high. The entire exterior, now this is an enclosed building within this large courtyard. An enclosed building. It's the only enclosed space. Now, this whole building, the sanctuary, is completely covered on the outside with gold. And it's not gold leaf like we have sometimes on our icons, and you can see how beautiful, how shiny it is. This is gold, the thickness of a coin. The entire facade of the temple building itself, that is the sanctuary, was covered in gold. And at the top, to make sure that birds didn't land on there and mess up the holy place, the whole top was ribbed with gold spikes. Now, we want to enter the sanctuary. As we're facing the sanctuary, at the top of those 12 steps, there are 4 huge white marble columns, Corinthian columns, huge white marble columns. And they are as high as that space. They are gigantic. They are 17 stories high, massive marble columns in front of the holy place, in front of the sanctuary. The entrance to the sanctuary is in the middle of those 4 columns. So there are 2 on your left and 2 on your right. And below that is the entrance. That entrance itself also, because there's sort of a porch, you come up those steps, just like you would come up the steps of a house, come up 12 steps, and there's a big porch. There was a porch that ran along the entire length or entire width of the sanctuary. And beyond that was the actual entrance. And that entrance itself was framed by another 4 white marble columns. They were half the size of the huge columns outside the sanctuary, but they were still about 60 feet high, which is pretty big. But those were decorated with gold. There was a massive gold cluster of grapes along the top of that opening, the lintel, that is, think of a doorway. Along the top of the doorway, there was a massive cluster of golden grapes, grapes made out of pure gold. And then as people would come and bring more gold and donate it to the temple, they added to it. Priests were trained as goldsmiths. They kept adding to this cluster, and they created a vine and leaves, and they encircled and they wrapped around in a beautiful manner these beautiful white columns that were framing the entrance to the holy place. So, as you entered the holy place, between these 4 columns, the smaller, the half the size, but still 60 feet high, you entered into the holy place. Now you are in the holy place. In this place, there were some very important things for the daily worship of the Lord. Here you had the table of showbread, the place where they would place sacred bread, and they changed it every week. There was a giant menorah and an altar of incense. Okay, an altar of incense. All of these were fashioned out of pure gold. So I'm just trying to help you understand the massive opulence of the temple. Now, in front of you is the veil of the temple. We're going to talk about this later. When the temple veil is torn, we're going to talk about how many veils there were, and there's some controversy about this, because according to the Torah, there were supposed to be two veils, an exterior one or an outer veil and an inner veil. But it seems that at the time of Christ, there was only one veil. So this is the temple curtain, but it's not like any curtain you might see in a theater. That's even if that's very fancy, like velvet or something, or kind of thick or kind of heavy. This temple veil was colored in blue and purple and embroidered in gold with stars and lions and eagles. That's not how it was described in Exodus, in case you think I don't know what I'm talking about. This is the description that's given to us about the first century temple. It didn't always match what Exodus was, what the instructions that Moses had been given. So you have this curtain. But this curtain is massive. Remember the size of this structure that I told you about? This curtain is massive. It is the thickness of your hand, the width of your hand. And it required 300 priests to put it up and to lower it or to wash it. 300. And it took 2 years to make. And there were girls who worked on the weaving of the temple curtain and the embroidery of the temple curtain. So this was a huge, again, massive curtain. That's why the tearing of the temple curtain was so extraordinary, because it wasn't like a curtain you might have in your house or in a theater or something like that. So beyond that was the Holy of Holies. So within the temple curtain, once you passed into the holy space, that's called the holy place. And then after that, you have what is called the Holy of Holies. And at this time, it was a closed room. It was completely covered in gold, but it was very high. It was a closed room, and it was completely covered in gold, and that was the place where only the high priest entered once a year on Yom Kippur to sprinkle the blood, to ask God to forgive the sins of the people. Nobody else ever set foot there. And in order to clean it, the whole area, the whole room was covered in gold. It was the whole thing. All of the walls were completely covered in gold, but there were beams across the top. And in order to keep it clean, priests were lowered down in baskets to try to keep the area clean, but they couldn't set foot in there. You see, that's how they got around the cleaning aspect of it. So the most holy place, which is also called the Holy of Holies, was a dark, windowless room with walls completely covered in gold. When it was Solomon's temple, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. But the Ark of the Covenant disappeared with the destruction of Solomon's temple. And at the time of Christ, there was just a very low platform, like a few inches high, that marked the spot where the Ark of the Covenant had once stood. So now you have entered into the temple. So I'm going to read to you from Mark. We'll talk about what happened to the temple, what happened to it. In Mark's Gospel, this is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 13. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So what happened to the temple? And because this changed everything for the Jewish people, life and Judaism has not been the same since the destruction of the temple. Well, as I mentioned, Herod the Great's program of enlargement and beautification of the temple took 80 years. But shortly after its completion, and by the way, I told you how many people were working on this project, all kinds of different craftsmen and tradesmen, 18,000 workers were suddenly unemployed, and it created a depression. There was an economic depression in the city because all these people were suddenly unemployed. And the king at the time, Herod Agrippa, and other people had to find something for them to do. So they started resurfacing the roads or something like this. So, because this was a huge project, it had gone on, for 8 decades. So, a few years after the completion of the temple, the Jews revolted against the Roman Empire, and this led to or caused the Jewish War. And Jerusalem was so well fortified because of its walls and its sort of strategic, the way it was situated, surrounded by these, on top of this little high mesa or high plateau. It took the Romans 3 years to get into the city of Jerusalem. They surrounded it. They put it under siege. It's one of the most heartbreaking accounts. We have eyewitness accounts of what happened to the Jews inside. Many of the Jews were just stuck. They had actually gone to Jerusalem for Passover. The Romans arrived and surrounded the city, and they were stuck inside of it, and they couldn't escape. They couldn't get out. And none of the Christians were there, by the way, and none of the Christians participated in the revolt. The Christians were warned to, either in a dream or a vision, I can't remember which, to leave the city, and they did. They were told that the Romans were coming, and they left, and the church went to Pella, which was a city out in the desert, and they stayed there during the Jewish War. Then they came back after the war was over. So it took the Romans 3 years to just get into the city of Jerusalem, and once they finally entered the city, all the people inside ran to the Temple Mount, and they barricaded themselves up in the Temple Mount, and they really hoped that God would protect them. But the Romans also breached the temple, and in the course of the fighting, a fire broke out, and this destroyed the temple. The story was, and I believe it, that Titus, he was the general in charge at that time. Later, he became the Roman Emperor Titus. He didn't want to destroy the temple, and I think that's true because it was a show place. There was nothing like it on the face of the earth. But it caught fire, and in the fighting, it caught fire, and it burnt to the ground. And the people were slaughtered inside the temple. If they were young enough to work as slaves, they were taken as slaves, or they were sent to the mines, or they were taken back to Rome for the triumph, for the victory parade of Titus. And there is, outside of the Colosseum, an arch. It looks like it's a Roman arch. It looks like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. It's that kind of a shape. That's a Roman arch. It's called the Arch of Titus. And inside the Arch of Titus, you can see Titus and the Jews coming behind him and the menorah. And it depicts his victory parade, having defeated the Jews in the Jewish war. But I want to talk to you about Jesus's prophecy. That was, I'm sure, shocking. Of course, he prophesied the destruction of the temple. Jeremiah the prophet also prophesied the destruction of the temple. It was Solomon's temple, and he turned out to be right also. Jeremiah was sentenced to death for prophesying the destruction of the temple. Now, that wasn't carried out. He told them that would be very bad for them if they killed him for prophesying. So they didn't kill him then. Later, Jeremiah was killed by the Jews for something else, because all the prophets were killed by the people that they were giving the prophecy to. But Jesus also foretold the destruction of the temple. Now, we're going to talk about how he comes into conflict with the Jewish leaders over the temple, but it's not the mere prophecy of the destruction of the temple. What it amazes me about it is how he says there will not be left one stone upon another. And if you think about it, there are some remnants of temples today, right? There are temples, there might be only a couple of columns standing, the Acropolis or the Temple at Delphi or Cape Sunion in Greece or other places. There are still temples. What happened to this temple that literally there is not one stone left? That there because it's a fire, and most of it was made out of wood, right? Most of it was made out of stone, not out of wood. There was wood. There were flammable things in the temple, so we get that it burnt, but the stone should still be standing there. Why was there not left one stone upon another? Well, think about it. After the Romans departed and they took the slaves, the Jews who were vanquished in the war, back to Rome, or they took charge of this area, all that gold that I described to you and all that silver that covered all those doors and all the decorations. And by the way, they needed, just think about this, 90 bowls, 90 gold bowls for daily use in the temple. 90. And they were made of pure gold. And if any instruments, or bowls or any other kinds of vessels, cups, whatever they needed, were not made of gold, they were made of silver. So everything was very, very expensive. All of those things were destroyed in the fire. They melted in the fire. And all of that gold crept or seeped into the stones that were used to construct all of these different rooms and all of these different walls. And people came to the site and they took apart the stones and they scraped the gold off of the stones. You see, that's why the Lord's prophecy was absolutely correct. There was not one stone left upon another. And guess what? There was so much gold in the temple. There was so much gold recovered from the ruins of the temple that the market for gold in the region dropped by half. Gold glutted the whole area. The cost of gold, the value of gold dropped by half because of all the gold that was recovered from the site of the temple. So now you know the rest of the story of what the Temple of Jerusalem was like. Well, we didn't get to anything else today, but I hope you enjoyed our little tour of the temple at Jerusalem. And next week, I'm trying to remember what I have on our schedule. See if I can find it to tell you what we're going to be talking about. And I forgot to have it handy to tell you what we're going to be discussing next week. But we're going to continue with our discussion of life during the time of Jesus, and we're getting ready to understand and follow him along his passion. So join me next week, and now let's close with a prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people. Amen. Good night.